Dostoevsky and his brothers Karamazov has a fascinating exchange between this figure called the Grand Inquisitor and Jesus. And the Grand Inquisitor hauls Jesus over the coals. And he says, you ask too much of people. What you call them to, the freedom that you call them to, the responsibility that you call them to was just beyond them. It was cruel. What we did, he representing a church that has fallen far short of Jesus, what we did was we gave them a manageable set of rules. Do this and you'll be a nice person. Do this and you'll be a good person. Do this and it'll be plenty. And what I'm really asking tonight is, do we agree with the Grand Inquisitor? Are we Team Grand Inquisitor, or are we Team Jesus? And the answer to that question isn't as simple as we might think, because how we act and live will determine whose side we're on. Now, what I want to start talking about is the incredible critique of wealth that the Jesus movement represents. We have in all the synoptic gospels the story of the Jesus and the rich young ruler. And the rich young ruler is a better person than me, and probably a better person than most of you. He's kept the commandments every day of his life. He's good as gold. And yet Jesus tells him, if you want to follow me, you must sell all you have, give it to the poor, and then follow me. And the rich young ruler just walks away, downhearted. Why is the rich young ruler, who is not the rich but bad young ruler, he's not the rich but Donald Trumpy ruler, he's simply wealthy, why is he cast away? Well, the answer to that really, I think, is predicated upon how economics is understood in the first century. Now, if someone is looking for ways of critiquing the arguments that I'm making here, one of the ways would be to say that the first century has economics wrong. How does it understand economics? Well, it understands it on the basis of the fact that God is infinite. God alone is infinite. Everything else, therefore, must be finite. Simple as that. This does not mean scarce. God would not create a world in which there was not enough for people to eat, not enough shelter for people to have. There is plenty, but it is finite. Everything else follows from that. Therefore, if someone has more than they need, someone else will necessarily have less. So there's a causal relationship in the Gospels between wealth and poverty. It's a bit like the world's resources is like a big, massive pizza. That's enough for everyone. Everybody can have enough from this pizza. But if David Dean has a massive slice, then Becky Cullihan is going to have a smaller slice. And so therefore the wealthy are directly responsible for poverty. Now we see that quite brilliantly in Luke's gospel. Here we have the story of the rich man and Luke. And we have this dichotomy between two contexts, the world and the kingdom. And in the world, you have the rich man at the top. And poor Lazarus is at the bottom, hoping for crumbs to fall from the rich man's table. This is the global hierarchy. Now remember, again, it's not the rich man who was a scumbag. All he is rich. Yet, because of that, we have the kingdom, or we have the afterlife, and the rich man is down in Hades. Hell. Lazarus is up with Father Abraham, happy out. And the rich man is hoping for Lazarus to dip his finger in the water and let drops fall down to cool the rich man's burning tongue. A perfect parallel by Luke to the crumbs. Basically getting it and sticking it in our face and saying, look, do you get this? The great reversal. The last are first, and the first are last. And this is central to how the early church proceeded and church theology proceeds. That the understanding, and we have here in Matthew 25 is an example of this, And I was talking earlier on in the week in a different context about the Council of Nicaea. And it establishes the idea that Jesus Christ is true God. This is the Christian faith. And therefore that in Jesus Christ, God binds himself from all eternity to the poor, to the lowly, to the marginalized, to the disenfranchised. Jesus, all through the Gospels, Jesus will speak in parables. So if Jesus comes out and he says, look, there was a man who had 2 sons. You know he's not talking facts. He's telling a story about God's love, because the elder son will do various things and the younger son will do various things. But Jesus breaks with this parabolic structure in Matthew 25 when he says, I was hungry. I was thirsty. And Jesus is hungry. He's hungry in the desert. I was thirsty, and he is thirsty on the cross when he asks for water and he gets vinegar. I was naked. He's naked on the cross. I was imprisoned. He's imprisoned by Pilate. He's speaking in the first person, and he says, when you do this to the least of my people, you do this to me, because he has bound himself from all eternity to the poor, the lowly, and the marginalized. If we want to serve, for the early Christians, for the Christians who drafted the Creed of Nicaea, if we want to serve God, we must serve God where God has revealed himself. And he has revealed himself in the poor, in the lowly, in the marginalized, in the imprisoned. Now, this is what the Grand Inquisitor means. This is why the Grand Inquisitor might be. He says he's kinder than Jesus. Is he? Because who's in prison? Who are those who Jesus Christ tells us to care about? He doesn't say, I was a political prisoner wrongly imprisoned. He doesn't say, I was a cool fighter against global fascism. I was imprisoned. Now we know who's in prison. Rapists, pedophiles. These are the people who are in prison, and Jesus Christ is directing our gaze to these people, and Jesus has bound himself to these most marginalized people. And because of that, there's a patristic maxim, and here it's quoted. When the God who is Lord becomes a servant, the servant becomes Lord. This is the great trajectory. This is from John Chrysostom, but they all say it. This is the principle that drives the Council of Nicaea. I'm going to constantly refer to the Council of Nicaea because we're doing that in a course, and some of the students from the course are over there, and so I'm pushing this Nicaea angle a lot. That when the God who is Lord, the first, becomes last. So the God who is first becomes last in Jesus Christ. Therefore the last become first. We saw that in the earlier slide. When the God who is Lord becomes a servant, then the servant becomes Lord. Blessed are the poor, from one sense, is the most stupid thing anyone ever said. If we forget that God who is blessed has become poor in and as Jesus Christ. So what we have in the early church, what we have in the gospel, is the idea that wealth and Christianity are incompatible in a world where people are going hungry. Just incompatible. What we have in the gospel is the identification of God with the poor and the lowly, such that to serve this God is to serve the poor and the lowly. And what we have, and one of the best speakers on this is Augustine, John Chrysostom too, but Augustine looks at the way that we keep on trying to accumulate things. We can't help it. We want more food than we need. We want more possessions than we need. We think if I have that car, I'll be happy. If I have that garment, I'll be happy. If I have that piece of furniture, I'll be happy. We have this rage to become more, to accumulate more things. And this rage seems to be in us to such an extent that in the Bible, in the New Testament, in the early church, they think of it as a powerful demonic force called Mammon. That this thing that drives us to have more than we need. This thing that drives us to have security. More security than we need. Like Jesus, again, how cruel is Jesus? He says, look at the lilies of the field. Look at the birds of the air. They don't have homes. What are you worried about? That's a brutal thing to say to us. He's challenging us to have the faith and the freedom to let go. To not be bound to these attachments that force us to seek to accumulate and have more than we need. This is a brutal challenge, particularly when we see what happens to the rich young ruler. And here is a figure. This is a drawing from some website. But it's a drawing of the most terrifying figure, in my opinion, in Dante's Divine Comedy. It's from the Inferno, and this is the she-wolf. And Dante used the she-wolf to talk about this human propensity. Because the she-wolf is possessed of a ravenous hunger. Like, look at her, her bones showing. She's emaciated, she's starving. She's possessed of a ravenous hunger, and yet every time she eats, she gets hungrier and hungrier and hungrier. And for Dante, that's like us. We think, if I have that person, I'll be happy. If I have that car, I'll be happy. If I have that house, I'll be happy. If I have that garment, I'll be happy. Or on Amazon, if I have that ridiculous trinket, I'll be happy. If I have that trash, I'll be happy. And in one sense, we're a kind of right. Studies have shown that when we are shopping on Amazon and we're looking for a product, a new shirt or whatever, the research we do to try and decide, is this good, and we look through the reviews, our dopamine levels are really high. And when we order it, our dopamine levels are really high, and we're tracking it. It'll be here in 2 days' time. Our dopamine levels are really high. And then when we get it, our dopamine levels drop. If what we're buying, the dopamine that we're buying, we get before we get the object. Why? Because the object is shit. It's not meaningful. So too the she-wolf is consuming things that aren't meaningful. What she's looking for is meaning, is love, is goodness, is reality. She's looking for God. But she thinks, if I have this person, car, house, garment, food, I'll be happy. But it's meaningless, and so she's just eating emptiness. And so consuming and consuming and consuming. And every time she eats, she gets hungrier. Every time we shop on Amazon, the dopamine goes away when we get the thing, and so we need to get more, and only this hit can get us more. We're kept on this cycle of craving commodities. Now, this process is part of the bedrock of our contemporary society. And I want to emphasize this by contrasting our buddy Hildegard of Bingen with modern capitalism, because what I want to suggest is that modern capitalism and the logic of the modern world, in fact, the logic of the modern secular world, is a logic which Christianity needs to oppose. And Hildegard gives us an example why. So let's say Hildegard is looking at a tree or a field, a river, a lake, an animal. Well, there's two things happening there. There is the thing as it appears to her. And she says, I see what it is. And I can describe it, and I can say it's got this color, it's got this height, it's got these properties. If there's pears on it, I know I can get fruit from it, and this is a good thing. And that's part of what the tree is. But what's far more important for Hildegard is that behind the tree, there is God's love in order for the tree to be. Now, this is a very traditional theological principle, so I don't want to get too metaphysical here, but being is not something we have by nature, in a sense. So I will cease to be. I don't have the capacity to be eternally. I'm just kind of borrowing it for a while. That's not who I am. And so everything that is in the natural world for Christians is only because God gives isness to it. And so God is the source of the tree's being, and God's presence, which is necessarily, is present within the tree. So the tree has a dignity. The river has a dignity. The natural order has a dignity which comes from the presence of God within it. Some of the students, Becky was at a class last Wednesday night when we looked at this as the basis for human dignity. From the Christian point of view, Anya has dignity because God is really present in Anya as God's love. And if Anya can't work the tech, she doesn't lose this dignity. If she can work the tech, she doesn't gain this dignity. It's hers simply because of the fact that God loves her. She's not reducible to her attributes or how she appears. Now, if we're talking about what the secular West is, we could do worse than to learn from a thinker who has an awful lot more to offer Christianity than Christianity properly accepts. And that's Karl Marx. Now, Karl Marx is not the most popular thinker among Christians. Rightly so. He's a radical atheist. But Marx is also a genius. And geniuses, whether they're wrong about the reality of God or not, have something to offer us. And Marx says that before you can have capitalism, before you can have an industrial revolution, you had to lose this Hildegard side of the equation. You have to reduce the natural world to a commodity before you can do whatever you want with it. If people are going around saying, yeah, I'd love to chop down this tree, but this tree, I'm afraid, has got the presence of God in it, and so therefore I can only chop it down if it's going to be for shelter, which I need, and it's part of God's plan for creation. You can't have a good industrial revolution if people are going around asking those questions. So for Marx, the West, with figures like Immanuel Kant, and we can come to, if we want, we can get into how Kant brackets the noumena, the thing in itself, and works exclusively with the phenomena, how something appears to us. And when we do that, everything is reduced to a commodity. So let's say, and we learned this in science, so let's say there's Paul, right? Here's Paul. And let's say Hildegard is talking about Paul. She would describe Paul, and she would say he's a handsome, intelligent man. And she would also say that there is the real presence of God in Paul, which gives Paul a dignity which can neither be earned nor lost. And it's not reducible to Paul's attributes. Now, this whole hocus pocus thing, Paul's dignity that comes from the presence of God in Paul, well, we got to scrap that in the modern West. That's, if you're in university, even at AST, and you say, well, the stock market crash happened and then there was all these measurable and quantifiable things, but what we're not seeing is the presence of God, well, no one's going to say that that's legitimate. Is that me? Oh my goodness. Okay, let's, I boobed dialed you, even worse. So we can't say, so we reduce a thing to its attributes, and then we can understand. So we induce it to its measurable and quantifiable properties. An example I give about this is a student at St. Mary's who was an Islamic student, and I may have told you this before, but he came to me upset and frustrated because he had just got back a paper on the Battle of Hattin, and he got a C. And this was horrific for him because all his life he was obsessed with Saladin in the Battle of Hattin. And he showed me the comments and said, I don't know what they did wrong here. Like, this is my thing. And the comments were saying, well, you can't really say that the will of Allah was a big factor here because that's not history. So he was understanding reality as involving the will of Allah and the presence of God as well as what was measurable and quantifiable. And he was being told in a Western university, you can't do that. You've got to pretend not to be Muslim in order to take a course here. Forget Allah, bracket Allah's will, bracket Allah's role in the Battle of Hattin, and just work with things that are measurable and quantifiable. This is the Western way. If Anya's writing a history paper and she's writing about World War I, she's not going to talk about angels. She's got to pretend there is no God, that only material forces govern the real. She's got to pretend the real is banal, and then she'll do fine. But this, as Marx knows well, renders reality banal, robs it of its enchantedness and its sacredness, and then we can do whatever the hell we want with it. Think about the move from Hildegard's garden to the battlefield of the Somme. This move from an enchanted understanding of reality to a banal understanding of reality, disenchanted. And this is what capitalism thrives off. This is what capitalism requires. It requires an industrial revolution where reality is reduced to the level of commodity. I don't know what this is for you. I can tell you what it is for me. For me, that phrase means it's a commodity. Its meaning is determined by me, by my needs, by my perspectives. And so this leads to a world which is largely robbed of enchantment. A world in which we crave the next item, the next object, in order to get the dopamine hit we need to function. We tell ourselves the world has never been better. And we tell ourselves that when suicide rates have never been more extreme. We tell ourselves that when deaths of despair are off the charts. And this is part of this contrast, this reality. And I want to suggest that things like Amazon, things like Google, things like Facebook, things like Apple, things like Microsoft, they require this logic to hold. Let me use an example, and this example comes from Shoshana Zuboff, whose book Surveillance Capitalism should be read by everyone. It's a little bit old now, but it's still vitally important. So Zuboff looks at what's happening when you're looking at a screen like this. So let's say Anya there is looking at a web page. So that web page is taking milliseconds to load. But there's all these boxes on the web page, and these boxes are spaces for advertising. Okay? So what will happen is Beverly will go on a website, and the website will have images of horror in Palestine. And her stress level will go through the roof. And if she's given Chrome, so Google will say, you can use this for video chat. Just click here, 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 and let us have your camera and your microphone. And so Beverly says, well, I like video chat. Click, yes, I would like you can use my camera and my microphone for the video chat. But now the camera's looking at her eyes. When she's looking at the horror stories from Palestine, it sees her eyes dilating. It knows she's stressed through the roof. And so then it does something really interesting. It sells a little space for advertising, not to a product. It sells a little space for advertising to one of those bizarre boxes like, you'll never guess what these 1990s sitcom stars are doing now. You know those ridiculous things that come up? Or 10 easy ways to avoid stress. Or, or something about some celebrity or something. And Beverly will go, oh my goodness, click. Joey from Friends, what are you doing now? And then when she does this, all of a sudden, her stress level will go right down. Her happiness level will go up. And if there's an ad in the corner, subscribe to Audible, she's going to be 10 times more likely to click it. And the algorithm knows that, and so that ad will be worth 10 times more than on the previous page. So on the previous page, if you had an ad for Audible, it might sell for 0.000001 cent. But now on this page, it'll sell for 0.001 cent. It's so much more valuable because it's manipulated and mined Beverly's stress responses to tell her, this can make you happy.
What was have you spelled
So it's Soshanna is her first name, and Zuboff, Zuboff, Shoshana Zuboff. And she has, the book is called Surveillance Capitalism. And she's brilliant, brilliant. And we've got to understand this causal relationship between stress, misery, and consumption, which is central to how capitalism works. So Zuboff is looking at these guys, these biggies. But even something as simple as McDonald's. McDonald's is recession-proof. McDonald's is recession-proof. And McDonald's sells primarily to the people formerly known as the proletariat. Working class people. Why? Because if you're living in misery or an ambient state of misery, if you have no self-respect, if everybody is doing better than you and you're struggling and everything is bad, I can have a happy meal and for the next 30 minutes I'll be okay. I can get all this sugar and all these carbs and all this dopamine into me, and all the bad stuff goes away. And so things like McDonald's and other cheap fixes will do better during recessions. The more misery, the more purchasing. Amazon, now again, yes, it had COVID was its dream period. And it wasn't simply its dream period because we were all in. It was its dream period because we were all stressed the hell out. I'm super stressed. What can I do? I've got to somehow buy toilet paper and bleach and Listerine and all these things. And all these things were things that we could shop for and consume. And like the she-wolf, we just consumed more and more and more and more. And so Amazon, its stock price went through the roof. So there is a symbiotic relationship between anxiety, stress, misery, and consumption, which is the logic of 21st century global capitalism. Now, very few of you, very few of me, have a retirement plan that doesn't involve or support of these companies. We're benefiting from this. We're benefiting from the situation where, so if I drive through North Dartmouth, which is a few hundred yards north of me, I see people who are living in various stages of misery. And these are people who earlier stages of capitalism would have called the proletariat. Their job would have been to make the stuff in the factories that fueled the world. Now, we in North America, or even in Western Europe, have very few factories relative to before. Our proletariat is largely in Asia now. And with the emergence of AI, Asia may well eradicate its proletariat. So, what's happening? What is happening to poor people under the conditions of 21st century capitalism? What's happening to the working class? Well, there's a sense in which we only understand 21st century capitalism properly when we realize that they can help capitalism more by buying things than by making things. What you have is a large section of people, and I apologize for this, and this is a little bit grotesque, but you have a group of people, vast swathes of people, who are being reduced to the status of battery hens. We don't try and make them healthy, but our healthcare system will ensure they're kept alive. We don't necessarily want to give them meaningful jobs and the dignity that comes with it, but we will give them enough money so that they can abide in misery. Because we're keeping them in a situation where they will need to consume Tim Hortons, alcohol, McDonald's, cigarettes, weed, all these things to fuel the economy. And this is the role of the proletariat, to live in misery To die deaths of despair. Deaths of despair among men in Canada between 18 and 45. Deaths of despair are by far the biggest killer. So deaths of despair, and the way deaths of despair are understood, it's suicide, it's drug addiction, overdose, or alcohol addiction. They don't even include things like obesity-related deaths in that. If you factored in obesity-related deaths, it would probably be the biggest cause of death in Canada to men up to 65. So we're living in a situation where the proletariat, if we're to understand capitalism, can no longer be thought of as miners and dockers and factory workers. They're battery hens that are being fed and kept alive with enough health care and enough money for them to buy endorphins and dopamine to get out of the misery, and therefore to fuel these things. Now, what I'm asking us to think about is the way that this horror, as it was understood in the Gospels, as it was understood in the early church, and as it was understood as late as Dante, is now the dominating logic of our age. Consumption is the dominating logic of our age, and the symbiotic relationship between disenchantment, misery, unhappiness, and the savage quest for dopamine. Remember what's happening when Beverly is looking at the webpage. The smartest people in the world. So Stanford did a study where it looked at their grads and which of their grads was making the most money. And the grads that were making most money were the grads that were involved in the neuroplasticity, which would study and assess how to manipulate minds like Beverly's to raise her stress and to get her to want to consume to reduce her stress. The reduction of humans to the status of battery hen.
Social psychology and consumer behavior.
This is surveillance capitalism is fighting back. So, I want to conclude in this last section by talking about what I think is the coal face of this. If capitalism is this thing which shapes our desire in problematic ways, which encourages us to see the world in a godless way, which reduces people to attributes, which reduces the natural order to commodities, if it's this Mammon monster, it's very, very difficult for us to imagine opposing it. But I want to talk about the stock market because that's in many ways what drives this thing, and that's something that we could, not in 5 years, not in 10 years, but we could say in 50 years, in 75 years, maybe the church would disentangle itself from the stock market as a clear focus goal. And we would only do that if we conceded the stock market is a problem. And I want to suggest that the stock market is a really big problem. And I want to look at three people to tell this story. The guy on the left is Thomas Piketty and his book Capital. The guy in the middle is James Baldwin. We'll talk about him in a second. And the guy on the right is Cardinal Becciu, and we'll come to him too. So, Thomas Piketty wrote a book called Capital. I'd also recommend you to read that. It's a book that I couldn't understand because I can't do math and numbers and graphs and charts, but I was very impressed by it. And the one thing I did understand from that is the fact that it's mathematically proven. So one of the things that good old-fashioned leftists used to always have a go at was trickle-down theory. Trickle-down theory is bullshit, terrible. These capitalists will talk about trickle-down theory. Well, Piketty shows the trickle-down theory is actually kind of right. What's trickle-down theory? It says that if Jennifer gets richer and richer and richer, then some of that will trickle down and the poor will get less impoverished. That's actually true. Poverty levels globally are going down. Capitalism brings people out of poverty. It's amazing. But what he also showed was that this growth that the growth that we have from wages, the growth that we have under the ambient circumstances of growth and improvement under capitalism is a line that will go like this. A better presenter would have a slide for this. It goes up at a fairly small gradient. The returns on capital, property, stock market, is like this. So here's the point. As the 20th century goes on, the gap between the haves and the have-nots will get larger and larger and larger. Inequality is mathematically certain to increase. Now, poverty, look at China, look at India, poverty is getting less. But inequality is definitely getting more. Is that a problem? Let's hear from James Baldwin. James Baldwin was a gay African-American man living in the Deep South in the 1950s and 60s. So he was not when he talks about oppression, it's not somebody else's oppression. He kind of knew what he was talking about. And one of the remarkable things about James Baldwin is that James Baldwin had tremendous empathy for his oppressors. So what Baldwin suggested was that inequality is the main driver of homophobia and of racism and things of this nature. Why? Because when he was looking around, he was seeing white people in Alabama who were the runts of the social litter. They thought of themselves as having no wealth, no good job, no respect in the community. They weren't, leaders in the golf club. They weren't the great and the good. They were stained by alcohol and poverty, and they were at the bottom of the hierarchy. And so they lived their life in a constant state of misery because of that, and self-loathing. But at least, Baldwin says, at least they weren't gay. At least they weren't black. At least they weren't a woman. And so their lifeline, their flotation device, lifesaver thing, was racism or homophobia or misogyny. It was the one thing that took away their despair, because at least they weren't like these utter terrible people. And so Baldwin's point was that inequality is like a handle that you turn, and the social pathologies come out the far side. Now, inequality is getting worse. Pardon?
Did he write a book?
He wrote some. I can email me after and I'll send you. He wrote a couple of books, but the majority of his good stuff was in short article form. So he wrote in the New Yorker. He wrote in other like Life magazine and things like that. So short pieces, and he's brilliant, and also a brilliant speaker. You might see on YouTube he debated William F. Buckley at Oxford, and he was just masterful. And so inequality, turn the handle, and you produce that. All those young men, and they are largely men, on Twitter who are disproportionately responsible for so much of the hate and the misogyny which has gone through the roof in the last 10 years, the racism, which is like, I don't know if you've seen, so there's this thing called Sora, right? And Sora is a ChatGPT form of TikTok, where people type in, make me a video of this, and it will produce a perfect video, right? And if you go and you scroll through some of these videos, you'll be amazed at the racism and the misogyny that, like some of us are old. It was never acceptable back in the day. It's getting much worse now. So who are these people? Well, for James Baldwin, they're not people who are working down a mine. They're not necessarily people who are suffering massive poverty. They're people who feel crap about themselves because they're not here. And that crapness is being redirected. There's a song, Rob is probably one of the few people who may have heard of this song. It was really popular before the last election. So this guy, this West Virginia guy, sang a song called Rich Men North of Richmond. Does anyone know that song? So this guy, he's a sort of a West Virginia guy, and he had this guitar, and it went viral and became tremendously popular. And it's really interesting because it starts off as a critique of the powerful and the elite. And he talks about, that your dollar's not worth any money, and, these elites hate you and they try and control you and all the rest of it. And in the second verse, he just has a go at fat and short people. He talks about, and the obese are milking welfare. If you're 5'3" and you're 300 pounds, or taxes ought not to pay for your bags of fudge rounds. Just incredible. And this is what happens. This is the post-liberal move, in a sense, that it quite rightly identifies the massive problem in the system, and then within seconds mutates, as Baldwin always said it would, to a hatred of trans people, of black people, of women, and so on and so forth. So, what this is suggesting is the capital, that the stock market is the greatest driver of inequality in human history, and we know that mathematically because of returns on investment outpacing these returns. That's point one. Point two is equality drives social pathologies and increases misery. Point three is that the university that I'm part of, that the church I'm part of, depends entirely on its participation in the stock market to survive. So here's how full of shit we are, right? We academics, we will march, we will strike, we will do anything we can to talk about how terrible racism is, and how terrible homophobia is, and all these things, and all the while, it's our hand on the pump churning out these social pathologies. So on the one hand, we owe our financial success and indeed our employment to this thing, and then we're lamenting the cause of it. It's a bit like kicking people in the face and then going, did you see he got kicked in the face? This is terrible. And then people say, David is so compassionate, he's fantastic. I was the one who kicked him in the face. And so this is what we're doing. And this guy, and I want to just conclude with him, Cardinal Becciu. Now, Cardinal Becciu got himself in disgrace, right? And the reason he got himself in disgrace, and Pope Francis, put him on trial, was because of corruption. That he was in London, and he was bidding against a whole host of Russian oligarchs for super rich property in London. And he did some terrible things. He used family members for the estate agents. He used family members to do the accountancy on the deal. He used insider dealing with other friends and family so that they could profit from the whole thing. And because of that, he's sent on trial. We are a church that rightly will say he's a terrible guy because he gives deals to his family members. We're not a church that says, what the hell is he doing in London buying property with Russian oligarchs in the first place? He was sent there by the Vatican. We sent him there and we said, look, there's property there going in, in Marylebone or, some of these places, and, that's going through the roof, and, the more Russian oligarchs, the more people are going to be buying for that. It's a tremendous investment. You, Prince of the Church, go over there and make this investment? That's the problem. The problem is that we are getting all the credit in the world for taking care of the victims of capitalism, while we're the ones who are driving it in the first place. Now people say, this takes us back to our buddy, the Grand Inquisitor. People will say, yeah, what do you want us to do? Well, don't ask me, ask him. No, he tells us a kind of what to do. He says, David, we didn't make you so you could be really wealthy and really comfortable and at the upper echelons of society. We made you so that you could follow Jesus Christ, who, as he says himself, I was hungry, I was thirsty, I was imprisoned, who takes the side of the lowest person in society. My good lady wife, who I love and adore, is involved in fundraising for the Archdiocese, and this is a good thing to do, and I'm throwing her under the bus here, and I shouldn't. But she's involved in fundraising so that they can do upkeep on the homes, which is good in one sense. And so people of priests and of the bishop, and people would say, well, what do you want? Like, do you want them living in a tent? Can you imagine how great that would be? Seriously, can you imagine if you were a follower of Jesus Christ who was living like Jesus Christ? We talk about the new evangelization. And you say, okay, David, you write books and you... Screw that. David, shut up. Have a bishop living in a tent. And that is the new evangelization for you. That will transform things. If Christians walked the walk and followed Jesus Christ, I think we do far better. Now again, I'm not talking about, there's lots and lots of people whose retirement depends on investments to keep them out of tents. I'm certainly not talking about the fact that we need to divest tomorrow. I'm saying that we, under Pope Leo, who criticized usury strongly a couple of weeks ago, or a week ago, we need to say by 2060, by 2070, we will be living in a church that's modeled more on Jesus Christ than the Grand Inquisitor. We will be living in a church where scholars act like scholars and don't demand all kinds of high payment, where we take risks, where we follow Jesus Christ to the cross, which is where he goes. That we focus for the next decades on divesting from this instrument of oppression. This instrument of oppression that drives misery, that drives consumption, and that forces us to imagine the world as disenchanted. I'd go so far as to say it is... Final thing, and I'll finish up with this final comment. One of the things about the Eucharist, the way the Eucharist is meant to function, is it looks like nothing. It tastes like nothing. It smells like nothing. And so we approach the altar and we receive the Eucharist, and we're training our brain to say, this nothing is in fact the most enchanted thing in the universe. There is nothing more sacred or enchanted than this. It's telling us that the world is charged with the glory of God. It will come out shining like shook foil, to quote our boy Jeremiah Hopkins. Or participation in the logic of capitalism is like participation in an alternative sacrament. It's like a liturgical act. Shopping on Amazon is like a liturgical act which shapes us, or dare I say misshapes us in the alternative way. And so how can we offer sacraments for the transformation of the world while upholding and participating in liturgical acts which directly oppose that? How can we seek to serve two gods, God and Mammon?